Hey, Georgiana, it's Pastor Ryan, and I'm so excited to be bringing this week's Take 5 to you today. So we're going to be starting the book of Jonah today, and I'm so excited to be in Jonah because I love the story of Jonah. So a couple weeks ago, I preached a sermon about Jonah, and over the past couple of weeks, I've also been leading a high school Bible study about Jonah, and now I'm doing the Take 5 about Jonah. So I've kind of been living in the book of Jonah for the past several weeks. And I'll tell you why I love the story of Jonah. Because the more I read Jonah, the more I get into it, the more I realize it's different than what I remember. So I have this Sunday school memory of Jonah, maybe you do as well, where it's a story about a guy who gets swallowed by a fish, of course, but really it's about a guy who does the wrong thing and then does the right thing. He does the opposite of what God asked him to do, and then he does what God asked him to do later on. He makes up for it. But the more I get into Jonah, the more I realize Jonah is a much more complex character. The story is much more complex than I think we often give it credit for. And so let's go ahead and get into Jonah. This is going to be starting at chapter 1, verse 1. And what's happening here is God is calling Jonah to deliver a message to a city called Nineveh. And here's how he responds. It goes like this. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So that's just the very beginning, and probably the most obvious thing that I can see in this very beginning part of the story is that Jonah does flee. So much like our memory from Sunday school, Jonah does do the opposite of what God wants him to do. He makes the wrong decision to start off with. But here's what you need to know about Jonah. When Jonah flees, Jonah really commits to it. So there's a part of this story where it says that Jonah paid the fare for the ship. But probably a more accurate translation of that from the original language is that Jonah paid her fare. That article actually has a gender to it, and probably it should be translated as Jonah paid her fare. So Jonah didn't just buy his ticket. The her refers to the ship itself, because we oftentimes call ships as a she. So Jonah paid her fare. Jonah paid the ship's fare. Here's what that means. Jonah may have chartered the entire ship, and that's how invested he was in running away from God. Jonah bought the entire ship, and that's how much he was invested. The other thing that you need to know about this story is that this is hard to kind of see if you don't have a map, so luckily we have a map for you. Now, Jonah is going down to the city of Joppa, the port of Joppa, which means he's probably pretty close to Joppa where he started, and he could have just gone over here to Nineveh like the Lord asked him to do. But instead, he leaves Joppa and sails all the way over here to Tarshish. So basically, Jonah is so determined to get away from God, he will go as far to the other side of the sea that a boat will take him. It'd be like God asking you to go to Tampa and minister to people in Tampa, and instead you get on a boat and you go to Africa instead. You go as far as the sea will take you away from what God has called for you. So Jonah is determined, and maybe it's for good reason. So Nineveh is the capital city of an empire called Assyria, which was known to be pretty violent. It was known to kind of have bad people in it. In the Bible, in one place, it calls it the city of bloodshed. And so Jonah may have had good reason not to want to go to Nineveh and share God's message. But Jonah forgets two things as he makes this wrong decision. He forgets two things, and he makes two mistakes. The first thing that he forgets is that God is a compassionate God, and God's heart is to save people and not destroy. God wants to save people even sometimes when they don't deserve it. And what the mistake that Jonah makes is that he puts his personal preferences and his personal feelings ahead of God's character. God wants to save and not destroy, regardless of how Jonah feels about the Ninevites. The second thing that Jonah forgets is really the condition of Israel, the condition of Jonah's own nation when God shows compassion for them. So if you flip over to 2 Kings 13 and 14, you're going to see a bit of a history around the character of Jonah. And what you're going to see is that Israel had a number of kings, and several of them did evil in the sight of the Lord. It actually says those words several times. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so Jonah forgets the condition of Israel when God showed compassion. So the mistake that Jonah makes is he forgets his own past, his own wretched state when God shows compassion. So here's what we can do today. You can think about this. Who can we show compassion on? Who can we show compassion to even when it's hard, even when maybe we think that person doesn't deserve it? And how can we not let our personal preferences and feelings get in the way of God's character, but instead let God's character drive our personal preferences and feelings? And the second thing that we can do is when we find ourselves in a seat of judgment, maybe when we have a position of authority, maybe we can determine the outcome of something, let us not forget the wretched state sometimes that God found us in, the state that we were in when God chose to show his compassion on us. And I think that's what the beginning of this story of Jonah really tells us and really forces us to think about. So we're going to get to the end of Jonah next week, and so I'd encourage you to read the whole thing in the meantime. And as we get to the end of Jonah, I'll give you a spoiler. It's really unclear whether Jonah is a good character at the end or not. It's unclear whether his story resolves well or it doesn't. But even if his story doesn't resolve well, we can still be determined ourselves to show God's compassion and God's grace on people who may not deserve it. So I'll see you next week. I'm looking forward to it.